The great gate of Minas Tirith had stood for centuries. Steel and stone wrought by hands, long dust reinforced by craft, and desperation across ages of war. It had turned back armies. It had weathered the malice of Mordor when the world was younger and the enemy less certain of victory. On the 15th day of March in the Third Age year, 3019, it broke. The ram called Grand struck again and again. Each blow rang like the death of hope across the Pelennor fields, across the seven circles of the city, across the hearts of men who had believed walls might save them. At the last stroke, the metal screamed. The Witch King rode before it mounted on a creature that had never drawn breath in sunlight. And when he spoke, the gate groaned as though the metal itself felt terror. Torches guttered along the walls, not from wind. The air had gone still thick with a wrongness that made veteran soldiers grip their weapons with trembling hands. Defenders who had held the line for days abandoned their posts. They ran. Not towards safety, there was none, but simply away from what approached. Only one figure remained at the broken threshold. Gandalf sat motionless on Shadowfax. The horse lord of all his kind held steady beneath him, though every instinct screamed to bolt. The wizard's staff rested across his knees. His face, weathered by ages the men around him could not fathom, showed nothing. No fear, no anger, only a terrible waiting. The gate shattered, metal shrieked, stone cracked. The sound rolled across the city like a physical blow. And in its wake came silence more absolute than any spell could conjure. The Witch King urged his mount forward, black robes shifting around a form that cast no proper shadow. Behind him the host of Mordor surged orcs, and worse things creatures dragged from pits where light had never reached. Then the torches died, not guttered, died. Every flame along the wall, every brazier in the courtyard, snuffed in the same instant as though a hand had closed over the world. Men cried out in the sudden dark. Some fell to their knees. The horses screamed. The Witch King halted.
You cannot enter here. Go back to the abyss prepared for you. Go back. Fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master. Go.
Gandalf's voice carried across the courtyard, steady and cold. The words of power should have blazed. Should have driven the darkness back, if only for a moment. They fell into the blackness and vanished like stones down a well with no bottom. Because the darkness was not the Witch King's doing. The stone beneath this broken gate cracked, not from impact, from pressure, from weight settling onto the world, from a direction that had no name in any tongue of Middle-earth. The crack spread like veins of ice running through marble that had stood unmarked for 1,000 years. Air grew dense. Breathing became labor. Men gasped and found their lungs working against something that pressed down from above and below at once. This was not malice, not the suffocating dread of the ring wraiths or the crushing despair of Mordor's shadow. This was presence, raw, uncaring, a force that existed and therefore changed everything around it simply by being. The Witch King's mount stumbled backward. The creature that feared nothing, that had been bred in darkness and fed on terror, retreated from the gate. Its master pulled the reins taut, but even the Lord of the Nazgul sat motionless now, waiting. A shape moved in the blackness beyond the gate, not walked, moved. The distinction mattered. Walking implied rhythm pattern, the measured gait of something that obeyed the world's laws. This was motion without concession. Each step made the stone groan, made the air shudder. The crack in the marble widened. Gandalf's knuckles whitened on his staff. The shape stepped through the broken gate and into the courtyard of Minas Tirith. Tall. The mind registered that first. Taller than men, though not impossibly so. Broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested violence held in check by nothing but whim. The darkness clung to the figure, not concealing, but framing a void, that outlined rather than obscured. Then sight returned. The torches did not relight. But eyes adjusted, found new capacity, saw what stood before them in shades of gray and black that should not have permitted vision. A man, or something wearing a man's shape. Black robes hung open and torn across his frame, revealing skin marked with old scars that told stories of battles fought for their own sake. A tattered white captain's haori draped his shoulders' edges, frayed as though shredded by 1,000 cuts. Hair stood in wild spikes bells tied into the strands, though no wind moved them. An eye patch covered the right eye. The left eye was open, gray, cold, fixed on the Witch King with an attention that had nothing to do with challenge or fear. The gaze of something deciding whether prey was worth the effort of killing. And the smile, not cruel, not mad, just pleased. The expression of a man finding exactly what he had hoped to find, even if he had not known he was looking. The blade resting on his shoulder was wrong. Not enchanted enchantment implied craft intention, the bending of the world's laws to purpose. This was a katana, oversized and jagged, its edge chipped and brutal, as though it had been beaten into shape rather than forged. Too large for any normal hand to wield. The metal gleamed dully in the returning torchlight, serrated and raw, carried one-handed with the casual ease of a man holding a stick. Gandalf urged Shadowfax forward 3 paces. The horse obeyed, though its legs shook. The wizard raised his staff. Light bloomed at its tip, white and clean, pushing back the unnatural dark. In that illumination, he studied what stood before him. Old beyond measure, Gandalf had seen the world take shape beneath the song of creation. He had walked among the Valar before the moon first rose. He knew every form of power that operated within Arda, the strength of Maiar, the craft of elves, the stubborn will of men and dwarves, the corruption of Morgoth's legacy. This was none of those things.
This is no work of the enemy, nor of the Valar. It comes from beyond the music.
The words were not loud, but they carried. Men heard them and understood nothing except that their defender, the wizard, who had always known what to do, spoke with the tone of someone announcing a catastrophe already in motion. The figure with the sword turned its head, looked at Gandalf with the same measuring attention it had given the Witch King. One eyebrow raised slightly.
You can feel it.
Not a question. The voice was rough, unconcerned, tinged with something that might have been amusement. It spoke the common tongue, but the accent belonged to no region of Middle-earth. The cadence was wrong. The emphasis fell on syllables that should have been soft.
Good. Makes this less boring.
Gandalf's staff blazed brighter. Power gathered white fire that had broken siege engines and scattered armies. He did not strike. His hand remained steady on the wood, but he did not unleash what he held ready, because he did not know if it would work. And worse, he did not know what would happen if it failed. The Witch King's mount pawed the shattered stone. Its master sat utterly still, crowned head tilted as though listening to something only he could hear. The black blade in his hand, forged for the slaying of kings, and the breaking of hope, remained sheathed at his side. He was calculating, weighing. The Lord of Angmar did not fear such things had been burned from him long ago, but he was not foolish. Power was power. Even wrapped in a form he did not recognize, it demanded respect, and this power reeked of violence barely contained. The figure, the thing that wore a man's shape, rolled its shoulders, a gesture of loosening, preparing. The sword shifted on its shoulder metal, scraping against skin with a sound like grinding stone. It looked past Gandalf, past the Witch King, out across the Pelennor fields where the armies of Mordor stretched in their thousands. Orcs, trolls, things dragged from the pits of Barad-dûr. The siege towers still burned from the last assault. The dead lay in windows where they had fallen against the outer wall. Mordor's host pressed close to the city a tide of malice and hunger that had learned patience only because Sauron's will demanded it. The figure looked at them and smiled wider.
Finally.
One word, spoken with the satisfaction of someone who had been promised a feast and just saw it laid out before them. Gandalf's horse took a step back without command. The wizard did not correct it. His eyes remained fixed on the man with the sword, and in his ancient mind, calculations ran faster than thought. Variables, consequences, the shape of what might come. Horns blew in the distance. Not the brass of Gondor, but something higher, clearer. War horns of Rohan carried on wind from the north. Dawn was coming. The Rohirrim were coming. The Witch King heard them too. His mount wheeled sudden and violent. Black robes swirled. The creature that bore him launched into the air with a shriek that made men's bones ache. But before he rose fully before the wings carried him toward the sound of those distant horns, the Witch King looked back once at the figure in the courtyard, not with fear, not with challenge, with the cold assessment of something that recognized another variable in an equation that had until this moment been calculable. Then he was gone. Dark shape against darker sky, racing toward the Pelennor fields, where destiny had already written his death in words he had not yet read. The figure watched him go, did not pursue, did not call out, simply stood sword on shoulder and watched as the greatest servant of Sauron fled to meet the riders of Rohan.
Running already.
The amusement in those words was genuine, not mockery. Just the pleased observation of prey doing what prey did when it sensed the hunter. Then, without looking at Gandalf, without addressing any of the soldiers who remained frozen along the walls, the figure walked toward the broken gate, walked out of the city, out onto the Pelennor fields, where the armies of Mordor waited and the horns of Rohan grew louder with each breath. Each step cracked the stone beneath its feet. Not from weight alone, from something else, something fundamental, as though reality itself objected to bearing what it had not been designed to hold. Gandalf sat motionless on shadow facts as the figure passed. The wizard's face showed nothing, but his mind raced through possibilities and discarded each one. His hand remained on his staff. Power still gathered there, white fire held ready. He did not strike, because in 5,000 years of existence, Gandalf had learned when to fight and when to simply bear witness to forces beyond intervention. The figure paused at the threshold of the broken gate, turned its head slightly, not enough to look back fully, but enough that Gandalf could see the profile. The smile, the eye that held nothing but anticipation.
Stay here if you want, or come watch, either way.
Then it was gone, stepping out into the darkness and the gathering armies and the approaching horns. The torches along the wall flickered back to life. Air rushed into lungs that had forgotten how to draw breath freely. Stone stopped groaning. Men looked at each other with faces gone pale. Some made signs against evil. Others simply stood trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Gandalf remained still. His eyes tracked the figure as it moved across the Pelennor fields, a shape of violence, walking calmly toward the greatest battle Middle-earth had seen in an age.
What was that?
A soldier spoke from the wall. Young. His voice shook, but held. He gripped his spear with both hands and looked to Gandalf for an answer. The wizard did not turn, did not take his eyes from the distant figure now barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom.
Hope, or the end of all things, I cannot tell which.
Thunder rolled across Pelennor, though the sky held no clouds. The drums of Mordor beat faster, sensing blood in the air. And from the north, louder now, undeniable, came the sound of 6,000 riders racing toward a battle that had just become something no song would ever properly capture. Gandalf lowered his staff. The light dimmed. He sat in the darkness and waited for dawn to show him what manner of catastrophe now walked among the armies of the world. Behind him, in the ruins of the great gate, the stone continued to crack, slowly, spreading like roots through marble. The marks of something that should not have been leaving scars on a city that had stood unmarked for 1,000 years. And out on the Pelennor fields, in the space between Mordor's host and the approaching dawn, something laughed. Silence held the broken gate like a fist around a throat. Men along the walls pressed themselves against stone, afraid to breathe. Afraid the smallest sound might draw attention from what stood in the ruins below. The torches burned again, but their light seemed thin, inadequate, as though the flames themselves knew they illuminated something they should not. Gandalf had not moved. Shadowfax stood beneath him, every muscle taut, ears flat. The wizard's hand remained on his staff. White fire still gathered there, unspent, waiting for a target that had already turned away. Out on the Pelennor fields, darkness pressed against the edges of vision. The host of Mordor stretched beyond counting orcs in their tens of thousands. Trolls moving among them like boulders, given Malice siege towers still smoking from the last assault. They had spent days grinding against Minas Tirith's outer defenses, breaking them piece by piece, and now they waited for the final order to pour through the shattered gate and drown the city in blood. They waited in perfect stillness because something had changed. Some presence had entered the equation of the battle, and even creatures bred for war in the pits of Barad-dûr could sense when the nature of slaughter shifted from certainty to chaos. The Witch King sat mounted above the broken gate, his fell beast's wings folded waiting. His crowned head turned scanning the darkness. Not searching for enemies, he knew where they were, had known for days, had orchestrated their deaths with the patience of something that no longer measured time in mortal spans. He was recalculating. The figure that had walked out of the city, the thing that wore a man's shape and carried violence, like other men carried breath, had vanished into the pre-dawn murk somewhere between the gate and the outer trenches. The Witch King could not see it, could not sense it through the usual channels of fear and corruption that mapped the living for him. It simply was not there to be found. And that absence unsettled his calculus more than any blade. Then from within the city a sound cut through the silence. A rooster crowed, small, insignificant. The kind of noise that happened every morning in 10,000 farmyards across Middle-earth, unremarked and unremembered. But here now in this moment, it struck like a hammer against iron, because it meant dawn, and dawn meant the hour had turned. The Witch King's mount shrieked, sensing its master's sudden tension. The creature wheeled in the air wings, carving arcs through darkness that was no longer quite as absolute. To the east, the sky had begun to pale. Not much, barely perceptible. But enough to change everything. From the north came an answering sound. Horns, not the brass of Gondor, desperate and defiant. These were different, higher, clearer. The war horns of Rohan carried on wind across leagues of open ground, and their music spoke of horses and green hills, and a people who had ridden to war, knowing they might not return, but came anyway, because oaths were oaths, and friends did not abandon friends in darkness. 6,000 riders. The Rohirrim, with King Theoden at their head, coming down from the north like a tide of iron and fury and doomed courage. Inside Minas Tirith, men heard those horns and wept, not from relief, not yet. From the sudden crushing weight of hope after hope had been ground to dust. Some fell to their knees. Others gripped their weapons tighter, finding strength in exhausted arms, because the alternative was to fail the riders who had come so far to die beside them. Gandalf's eyes closed for a moment. His lips moved, forming words in a language older than the city, older than the kingdoms of men. Not a prayer, an acknowledgement. The pieces had moved, the hour had shifted. And now the true test would begin.
They have come.
He spoke to no one, to himself, to the dawn. His hand finally loosened on his staff, and the white fire dimmed, not extinguished but banked, held ready for what would surely follow. The Witch King knew his moment at the gate had passed. This was not fear. Fear had been burned from him centuries ago when he first accepted the ring that bound him to Sauron's will. This was calculation, strategy. The recognition that the battle's axis had shifted and he must shift with it or lose the advantage. 6,000 cavalry striking the flank of his forces would shatter the encirclement, would give Gondor breathing room, would turn a siege into a melee where numbers mattered less and courage more. He could not allow it. Below him, the host of Mordor stirred like a kicked anthill. Drums began to beat. Orders barked in the black speech rippled through the ranks. The machinery of war briefly stalled by the appearance of something unknown ground back into motion. But before he committed fully to flight, before he drove north toward the Rohirrim and the battle that destiny had already written in his death, the Witch King looked back once more at the gate, at the empty space where the figure had stood. His gaze lingered. Not long. A heartbeat. 2. The assessment of a general who had fought wars for 3,000 years, who had broken armies and ended kingdoms, who knew the weight and measure of every threat he had ever faced. This one he could not measure. But the horns were blowing, and the dawn was coming. And some battles demanded attention, regardless of unknowns. The Witch King spurred his mount. The fell beast shrieked and launched skyward, wings unfurling with a crack like sails catching wind. They climbed above the broken gate, then wheeled north and dove toward the Pelennor fields, where the Rohirrim would soon break against his forces like waves against black cliffs. Behind him in the courtyard of the broken gate, a voice spoke. Quiet, rough, tinged with amusement.
Running already.
Kenpachi stood exactly where he had been before. He had doubled back without hurry because he could. The jagged katana still rested on his shoulder. The torn hori hung motionless despite the wind that had begun to rise with the approaching dawn. His single visible eye tracked the Witch King's flight with the attention of a hunter watching prey bolt. Not disappointed, just noting the fact.
Guess you weren't the main course.
He rolled his shoulders, loosening muscle that had not needed loosening. The bells in his hair chimed softly. Then he stepped forward, moving past Gandalf without looking at him, past the soldiers who had pressed themselves against the walls, past the rubble of the gate that had stood for centuries and broken in a single night. He walked toward the Pelennor fields, not running, not hurrying. Each step measured and unhurried, as though he had all the time in existence and knew it. But the stone cracked beneath his feet anyway. The air shuddered, and men who watched him go felt their hearts hammer against their ribs, for reasons they could not name. Gandalf finally turned Shadowfax. Looked down at the nearest captain, a man whose face had gone gray with sleeplessness and terror, but who still stood his post because duty mattered even when hope died.
Rally your men! Hold this position. The riders of Rohan have bought us time, but time means nothing if we do not use it.
The captain nodded, not trusting his voice. He wheeled to shout orders, and along the walls, soldiers began to move again, taking up positions, preparing for the next wave. They moved like men who had forgotten how to do anything else. Gandalf watched them for a moment, then urged Shadowfax forward. Not after Kenpachi, that would have been pointless. But toward the higher circles of the city, where the wounded needed tending and the living needed to be told that perhaps, just perhaps, they might see another sunset. On the Pelennor fields, Kenpachi stopped. He had reached the outer edge of what had been the Ramus Acor, the outer wall that had encircled the fields, now broken in a dozen places by Mordor's siege engines. Rubble lay scattered like broken teeth. Bodies, two Gondorian soldiers who had died defending a line that could not be held. He looked out across the expanse before him. Distance collapsed. Details sharpened. The darkness no longer obscured what lay ahead. The host of Mordor spread across the fields like a wound opened in the flesh of the earth. Thousands upon thousands of orcs formed into companies and regiments with the brutal efficiency Sauron's captains had beaten into them. Trolls scattered among them, each one worth 10 lesser creatures in pure destructive capability. siege towers and battering rams, supply wagons, the entire apparatus of an army that had come not just to conquer, but to erase. And to the north, still distant but closing fast, the Rohirrim. Kenpachi could hear them now. Not just the horns, though those still rang clear and sharp, but the thunder of hooves. 6,000 horses driven to full gallop across open ground, their riders shouting war cries in a language he did not know but understood perfectly, because Battle Fury spoke the same tongue in every world. His smile widened.
Now we're talking.
The gray eye fixed on the point where the cavalry would strike the orc lines. Calculated without thinking. Measured force against force, will against will, and found the equation satisfying in its simple brutality. This was not like the gate. The gate had been enclosed, limited, a skirmish dressed up as a confrontation. This was open ground. Room to move, room to cut. An enemy that stretched beyond the horizon and would not break easily, even under the charge of Rohan's finest. Perfect. Kenpachi stepped down from the rubble of the Ramas Acor and onto the Pelennor fields proper. The grass had been trampled to mud by days of siege. Blood and worse things soaked the earth. But he walked across it like it was a carpet laid specifically for his arrival. Behind him, Minas Tirith rose pale and wounded against the lightning sky. Men watched from the walls, trying to understand what they were seeing. Trying to reconcile the lone figure walking calmly toward an army of darkness with any narrative that made sense. They could not. So they simply watched. And across the Pelennor and the camps and formations of Mordor's host, something like unease rippled through the ranks. The orcs did not know why. They were not built for subtlety or introspection. But they sensed it anyway, the way animals sense storms before the first drop of rain falls. The drums beat faster. Officers barked orders. Weapons were raised. The horns of Rohan grew louder. Dawn broke. And in the space between the city and the encircling armies, between hope and annihilation, between all the careful plans laid by wizards and kings and the Dark Lord himself, Kenpachi Zaraki walked forward with his sword on his shoulder and death in his smile. Ready for breakfast. The Pelennor fields stretched 3 leagues from Minas Tirith to the Ramas Acor, the outer wall that had once ringed the farmlands and kept them safe. Once. Before Mordor came with engines and malice and the patience of something that had been planning this war for decades. Now the Ramas lay broken in a dozen places. Breaches gaped like wounds, rubble spilling outward, where battering rams and siege towers had done their work on the 13th of March. Bodies lay among the stone's defenders who had tried to hold a line that could not be held. Causeway forts smoldered. The fields themselves had been trampled into mud by the passage of armies that cared nothing for the harvest they destroyed. And across that devastation, Mordor's host had spread like rot across flesh. Tens of thousands. The words meant nothing until you saw them. Until you understood that black shapes stretched to the horizon in every direction, that the standards and banners of 100 orc companies rose above the mass, that the war drums beat in rhythm, coordinated across miles of battlefield, because Sauron's captains had learned their craft in wars older than the kingdoms of men. Kenpachi entered it alone. He had crossed the outer rubble without pause, stepped over bodies without looking down. The jagged katana rested on his shoulder bells, chiming faintly with each stride. His single visible eye swept the field ahead, measuring distances, counting formations, finding the places where the enemy had massed thickest. There, a concentration 200 yards out. Orcs in formation around a command-standard black iron pole, topped with something that might have been a skull, or might have been worse. Officers barking orders, runners moving between units. The machinery of organized violence. Kenpachi's smile widened. He did not hurry, did not charge. Simply walked forward at the same unhurried pace he had maintained since leaving the broken gate. The mud squelched beneath his feet. Morning mist clung to the ground, reluctant to burn off, despite the rising sun. An orc scout saw him first. It stood at the edge of the nearest company, crossbow in hand, scanning the approaches for threats. Its eyes found the lone figure walking toward them across open ground, and for a moment the creature simply stared, trying to process what it was seeing. One man, no armor, no banner, no support. The scout raised its crossbow. Kenpachi's blade moved, not fast. Fast implied effort acceleration, the bridging of distance through speed. This was simply the sword being there, in front of the orc, through the orc beyond the orc, and the creature falling in two pieces without ever understanding what had happened. The company noticed. Horns blew. Guttural voices shouted in the black speech. Orcs wheeled to face this new threat, this absurd threat, this single fool who thought he could walk into an army and survive. 50 of them. 100. They closed ranks, readied spears and blades, and prepared to swarm the idiot who had just killed their scout. Kenpachi advanced. The first rank charged. 12 orcs, howling their hatred, driven by the fury Sauron had bred into their blood and bones. The blade swept horizontal. 12 became pieces. The charge became a collapse. Blood sprayed across mud already dark with it, and the creatures behind stumbled over remains that were still twitching. The ranks wavered, because they could see now. Could understand in whatever dim way orcs understood anything beyond hunger and pain, that the thing walking toward them operated on rules they did not recognize. It did not tire, did not slow, did not show the smallest hesitation before killing. The officer, an Uruk-hai, twice the size of its lesser kin, roared orders. The formation tightened. Shields came up, spears lowered. They would hold. They would bury this thing under sheer weight of numbers, because that was what armies did to individuals, no matter how dangerous. Kenpachi hit them like a stone through glass, not metaphor. They shattered. Bodies flew. The command standard toppled iron pole, crashing to earth and taking 3 orcs with it. Screams rose and died in the same breath. The neat ranks collapsed into chaos as creatures that had been trained to hold formation broke and scattered because training meant nothing against something that should not exist. 20 seconds. That was how long they lasted. Kenpachi stood in the space it had occupied, surrounded by ruin. He rolled his shoulders again, loosening muscle that had barely engaged. His eye swept the field, already searching for the next concentration. Behind him, the survivors fled. Not in any organized way, just pure animal panic creatures running because the alternative was to stand still and die. And across the Pelennor, other formations noticed. Drums changed rhythm. Commands rippled through the host. Companies that had been moving toward Minas Tirith diverted. New orders, new priorities. Deal with the thing carving through their flank before it became a problem. But they were too slow, because Kenpachi was already moving toward the next cluster. A larger one this time, perhaps 300 orcs, with a cave troll lumbering at its center. The troll stood 15 feet tall, gray skin, thick as leather armor, carrying a hammer that could smash cavalry flat. Kenpachi looked at it and laughed, not mockery. Pure delight. The sound carried across the field, incongruous and terrible. And men on Minas Tirith's walls, who heard it, felt their hands tighten on weapons without knowing why. The troll charged. Ground shook beneath its feet. The hammer rose overhead, massive weight prepared to turn whatever it hit into paste. Orcs scattered from its path. This was their answer. Their solution to the problem, walking through their ranks. The hammer fell. Kenpachi stepped inside its arc and cut upward. The blade entered beneath the troll's jaw and exited through the crown of its skull. The creature stood for a moment, brain-bisected body not yet understanding. It was dead. Then it toppled sideways, hammer falling from nerveless fingers, to crush 2 orcs that had not moved fast enough. Kenpachi flicked blood from his sword and kept walking. The orcs around the fallen troll stared. Some dropped their weapons. Others simply stood frozen, watching as the thing that had killed their biggest asset moved through them, like they were wheat before a scythe. Then from the north, a sound cut through the chaos. Thunder, not weather. Hooves. 6,000 riders of Rohan cresting the last ridge and seeing the battlefield spread before them. King Theoden rode at their head banner, streaming spear raised high. His voice carried across the morning air, hoarse with age, but steady with the weight of oaths kept.
Arise, arise, riders of Theoden, spear shall be shaken, shield shall be splintered, a sword day, a red day, ere the sun rises.
The Rohirrim answered with their own cry, not words, just the raw sound of warriors who had ridden too far and lost too much and were done with caution. They leveled spears. Horses surged from canter to full gallop. The thunder grew until it drowned out even the drums of Mordor, and they struck. The northern flank of Sauron's host buckled. Cavalry hit infantry like a hammer against eggs. Spears punched through orc bodies. Hooves trampled those who fell. The Rohirrim drove deep into enemy ranks, carving a wedge, exploiting the confusion, giving Gondor the first real hope it had felt in days. But they did not see what the defenders on Minas Tirith's walls could see. They did not see the lone figure already moving through Mordor's center, opening corridors of death that no cavalry charge could have created. They did not see the formations collapsing, not from their assault, but from something else entirely. They did not know that the battle they had come to fight was being rewritten by rules no one had anticipated. On the walls, soldiers watched in silence. One pointed. Others followed his gesture. They saw Kenpachi, distant but unmistakable, moving through the host like a blade drawn across silk. Saw orcs scatter, saw standards fall, saw gaps open in formations that should have held. A young soldier spoke, voice barely above a whisper.
What is that?
The captain beside him, gray-haired veteran of 3 wars, did not answer. Could not. He watched the figure cut through another formation and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not relief, not hope. Recognition that they were being saved by something that might kill them just as easily when it finished with the orcs. Gandalf stood on the highest tier staff in hand, watching the battle unfold. His eyes tracked Kenpachi's progress across the field, tracked the Rohirrim's charge, tracked the way Mordor's host was beginning to fracture under pressure from 2 directions. They were winning, and the wizard felt no joy, because he could see what the soldiers could not, could see the way the earth cracked where Kenpachi walked, could see formations breaking not just from fear, but from the simple physical impossibility of holding ground that was coming apart beneath them. Could see the cost being written into stone and soil, a scar that would mark this field long after the war ended.
Victory always has a price, but some prices compound interest.
He spoke to Shadowfax, to himself, to the dawn. The horse's ears flicked back but did not respond. It understood in whatever way horses understood such things, that its rider watched something that troubled him deeply. On the Pelennor, Kenpachi reached another concentration orcs, rallying around a second cave troll. He did not slow, did not adjust his approach, simply walked into their midst and began cutting. The blade moved in arcs too fast for mortal eyes to track properly. Not because of supernatural speed, but because the brain refused to process motion that ended so many lives so quickly. Orcs fell in waves. The troll swung its club and hit empty air because Kenpachi was already elsewhere, already moving, already killing. Blood turned the mud black. Screams rose and died. The standard fell. The formation broke. And across the field, in 100 formation still holding their ground, orc captains saw what was happening and began to recalculate. Began to understand that the plan surround the city, starve it, break. It had just developed a variable that their lord had not anticipated. Some ordered retreat. Some ordered reinforcement. Some simply stood paralyzed, waiting for guidance from commanders who were too far away to give it. The Rohirrim carved deeper into the northern flank. Their charge had not slowed. Would not slow until the horses collapsed, or spears broke, or death came for them. This was what they had ridden through darkness to do. This was the answer they gave to the question of whether oaths mattered when hope died. But even Theoden, riding at the head of his people, began to notice something wrong. The formations ahead were breaking before he reached them. Companies scattering, standards falling, gaps opening in the enemy line that his cavalry poured through like water finding cracks. It was too easy. He did not slow, did not question. The Rittermark had come to fight and fight. They would, until the last man fell. But in the part of his mind that had commanded armies for 40 years, doubt stirred. This was not how sieges ended. Not how battles against Mordor were won. Something else was happening. Kenpachi stopped in the middle of the field. He stood surrounded by bodies. Orc, troll, things less identifiable. The mud around his feet had become slurry, thick with blood, and worse fluids. His sword dripped. The torn hourie hung heavy with gore. He looked north toward the sound of cavalry. Looked south toward the fleeing remnants of formations he had scattered. Looked east toward the bulk of Mordor's host that had not yet engaged. And he smiled.
Getting warmer.
Because this, the formations, the orcs, even the trolls, had been appetizers. Warm up. The outer edge of what Sauron had brought to this field. The real meal was still coming. Drums beat faster. Horns blew in new patterns. And from the eastern sections of the host, something stirred. Something larger. Companies moving with more discipline than orcs showed. Banners rising above the black tide, red and gold, the colors of Harad. Men, not creatures. Men from the south who had bent the knee to Sauron for reasons of their own and come to war with steel and strategy and something approximating honor by the standards of their homeland. And with them the war beasts. Kenpachi saw the shapes rising above the host. Massive. Gray. Moving with the slow certainty of things that had no natural predators. His smile widened.
There we go.
He moved east again. Not toward the Rohirrim. Not toward Minas Tirith. East. Toward Harad. Toward the beasts. Toward whatever Sauron had held in reserve, because standard orc formations were never going to be enough. Behind him the field he had crossed lay broken. Earth torn. Formations scattered. The dead piled in windows where organized companies had stood moments before. The Battle of the Pelennor fields had barely begun, and already it was being rewritten. The Rohirrim had broken through the northern flank. Spears dripped, horses foamed. Men who had ridden through darkness and death now found themselves in the heart of Mordor's host, carving corridors through enemy lines that closed behind them like water. And then the horses stopped, not from exhaustion, not from command. They simply would not go forward. The riders nearest the southern edge of the breach pulled hard on reins, trying to urge their mounts onward. Horses that had charged into orc formations without flinching now planted hooves and refused. Some backed away. Others turned their heads aside, eyes rolling white. Because ahead, rising above the black tide of Mordor's armies, shapes moved that spoke to something older than training, older than war. Mumakil. The war beasts of Harad stood 15 feet at the shoulder, gray skin thick as fortress walls. Tusks like battering rams, wrapped in bronze and spiked with cruel barbs. On their backs, wooden towers swayed war platforms, carrying archers and spearmen who rained death on anything that came within range. 6 of them, moving in formation across the southern field like living siege engines. Each one surrounded by companies of Haradrim men in scarlet and gold carrying curved blades and round shields painted with the black serpent of their homeland. Not orcs, not creatures bred in pits. Men who had marched to war under their own banners for reasons of pride and old allegiances that predated Sauron's current bid for dominion. and they were reforming the line, where Kenpachi had shattered orc companies and scattered troll-led formations. The Haradrim held. They moved with discipline, responded to horn calls, used the Mumakil as anchor points, rallying around the beasts because they knew what every cavalry commander knew: the horses would not charge something that made them want to flee. Theoden saw this and understood immediately. He sat astride Snowmane at the point of the wedge his riders had driven into enemy ranks. Around him, his best warriors, Eomer, the knights of his household, waited for orders. Behind them, 6,000 riders who had followed him to the edge of doom and beyond. And ahead, the wall they could not break.
The beasts, we cannot reach them while they hold.
Eomer spoke quietly, but his voice carried the weight of tactical reality. His horse sidled nervously, sensing the Mumakil even at this distance. Other mounts did the same. The charge was stalling. If they stopped here, surrounded by enemy forces on 3 sides, the Rohirrim would be ground down and destroyed. Theoden's jaw tightened. 70 years old. King of a people who measured worth in courage and oaths kept. He had ridden to war knowing he might not return, and he would not fail now because his horses feared what walked on 4 legs.
Then we find another way, the standards. If we can break their chieftain...
He stopped, because something was moving through the Haradrim lines. Not toward the Rohirrim. Not fleeing. Cutting laterally across the field, angling toward the nearest Mumak, with a kind of directness that suggested either madness or absolute certainty. A single figure. Man-shaped. Carrying something that caught the morning light and threw it back in jagged edges. Theoden had been briefed. Had heard reports from the walls of Minas Tirith about what had emerged from the broken gate. But hearing and seeing were different animals entirely.
What in all the green earth?
Eomer's question died unfinished as they watched the figure close the distance to the southernmost Mumak, watched Haradrim's soldiers move to intercept, watched those soldiers fall so quickly it looked less like combat and more like a plow turning soil. The Mumak itself noticed. It was old. Had been to war before. Bore scars from spears and swords that had tried and failed to bring it down. It recognized threats by some instinct carved into bone over generations. And this thing approaching without fear or hesitation registered as threat. It trumpeted. A sound that rolled across the battlefield like thunder so deep it made men's ribs vibrate. The tower on its back swayed. Archers leaned over rails, knocking arrows, drawing and releasing in practiced sequence. 20 shafts flew. Kenpachi did not dodge. The arrows struck, some glancing off, some punching into the torn fabric of his hori. One lodged in his shoulder. He reached up without breaking stride, pulled it free, and dropped it. Blood welled. He smiled wider. The Haradrim captain commanding the war tower shouted orders. More arrows. Spears now. The Mumak itself began to turn massive, head swinging toward this irritant that refused to die or flee like prey should. Kenpachi stopped 20 feet from the beast, looked up at it, at the tower, at the soldiers scrambling to coordinate their assault, at the sheer mass of muscle and bone, an ancient fury that evolution had shaped into something approximating invincible. He laughed, not loud, just a sound of genuine appreciation. The way a man might laugh when finding exactly the meal he'd been craving.
Now that's more like it.
The Mumak charged. 15 tons of muscle moving faster than anything that size had. Right to move. Tusks lowered. Ground shaking. The Haradrim around it scattered because they knew what happened to anything caught in that path. Broken, trampled, reduced to paste. Kenpachi raised his sword. One hand, the jagged katana held ready. Not blocking, not defending, just there, waiting. The distance collapsed. 10 feet, 5, 2. The blade moved. It entered at the base of the Mumak's skull, where neck met shoulder and continued forward. Through vertebrae. Through muscle cables thick as ship's rope. through the biology that had allowed this species to dominate the southern plains. For millennia, the cut did not slow, did not catch. Simply divided the beast from existence into two separate pieces that had not yet realized they were no longer one. The Mumak's front half continued forward for 3 strides. Then physics caught up with anatomy. The legs buckled. Momentum carried the mass into a slide that tore furrows in the earth. The war tower toppled. Wood cracked. Ropes snapped. Soldiers who had been standing at rails 60 feet above the ground suddenly found themselves in free fall. They hit earth and died. Or hit its own body and died. Or simply vanished under tons of gray flesh as the Mumak's corpse settled. The rear half severed, but still standing for a moment by virtue of mass and confused nervous system swayed once. Twice. Then collapsed backward, crushing the Haradrim soldiers who had been using it as cover. Silence spread from the impact point, like ripples in water. The Haradrim stared. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives for war, who had faced cavalry charges and siege assaults, who thought they knew the range of what was possible in combat. They stared at the corpse. At the figure standing beside it, sword already back on shoulder. At the blood running across mud in quantities that should have required 100 deaths. Their formation tight and disciplined moments before began to waver. The Rohirrim saw it from their position to the north. Eomer's hands tightened on his reins until knuckles went white. His horse had stopped sidling, stood perfectly still now, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the battle's geometry.
That's impossible.
Theoden said nothing. He had seen impossible things before, had stood against the Witch King at Helm's Deep in spirit, if not body, had watched his kingdom crumble and rise again. But this casual dismantling of a creature that legends said could not be killed went beyond what his 70 years had prepared him to witness. One of his riders spoke, voice shaking.
My lord, the Haradrim, their line is breaking.
It was true. The disciplined companies that had rallied around the Mumakil were scattering. Not fleeing, not yet, but losing cohesion. Losing the certainty that had held them together when orc formations collapsed around them. Because their anchor was dead. Their invincible war beast reduced to meat in the span of a breath. Theoden saw the opening and knew he would never get another.
Forward for the mark, for Gondor ride to ruin and the world's ending.
He drove his heels into Snowmane. The horse, no longer paralyzed by fear of the Mumakil, surged ahead. Behind him the Rohirrim answered with a roar that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with survival. They charged into the gap Kenpachi's kill had created. The remaining 5 Mumakil trumpeted, turned, began lumbering toward this new threat to their herd. But the Haradrim companies around them were already fragmenting. And without infantry support, the beasts became targets rather than assets. Kenpachi was already moving toward the next one. He did not run, did not hurry, simply chose his direction and went cutting through anyone who stood between him and the second Mumak. Haradrim tried to form a line, tried to coordinate. But they were men, and men moved at mortal speeds with mortal reactions, and Kenpachi was neither. The second beast died like the first. One cut. Clean separation. The war tower fell. Bodies rained down. And another anchor point dissolved, taking the soldiers rallied around it with it. On the third kill, the Haradrim broke, not all at once, not in panic. But the discipline that had held them together, the chain of command, the trust in their captains, the faith that their war beasts made them untouchable snapped. Companies began pulling back toward the city walls. Some tried to rally around the remaining Mumakil. Others simply abandoned formation and scattered. Theoden's charge crashed into them like a hammer on glass. The Rohirrim cut through disorganized infantry with the efficiency of cavalry doing what cavalry did best. They drove deep, turned, came back. The battle that had been a grinding stalemate minutes before suddenly became a rout. And in the middle of it all, Kenpachi stood beside the third corpse, looking toward the remaining 3 Mumakil, measuring, deciding. One had already turned to flee handlers driving it east, away from this thing that killed their kind with the casual ease other men killed chickens. The other 2 stood their ground, but the Haradrim around them were melting away, and without support, they were just large targets. Kenpachi's smile faded slightly.
Running again.
Not angry, just noting. The pattern was becoming familiar. Something appeared. Kenpachi engaged it. It either died or fled. Repeat. He wanted something that would stand still long enough to make it interesting. From the east, horns blew. Not Rohirrim, not Gondor. Deeper, harsher. The war calls of Mordor, rallying its scattered forces. And through the gaps in the melee movement, fresh companies, reserves being committed. Gothmog, the lieutenant commanding Sauron's armies in the field, was pushing reinforcements to shore up the collapsing southern flank. More Haradrim, Easterlings in their scaled armor. Varyags from Khand with their 2-handed axes. Professional fighters who had not yet tasted what moved through their ranks like a plague made flesh. Kenpachi looked toward them, and the smile returned.
Better.
He started moving east. Not toward the Rohirrim. Not to support any particular force or objective. Just toward the fresh meat that was marching to battle with confidence that would last exactly as long as it took him to reach them. Behind him, the Haradrim rallying point collapsed entirely. The 3 remaining Mumakil either fled or stood isolated, their war towers empty of archers, their massive bodies targets for Rohirrim spears, now that fear had been replaced by bloodlust. Theoden rode past one of the corpses Kenpachi had left, saw the clean cut, saw the impossibility made real. His face was grim.
Eomer, take the knights. Drive the Haradrim back to the river. Do not pursue beyond sight of the walls.
His nephew looked at him, surprise flickering across features spattered with blood.
My lord, we ride for Gondor, not for that.
Theoden's eyes tracked toward where Kenpachi had vanished into the press of Mordor's reinforcements. He did not point, did not elaborate. But Eomer understood. They were winning. But the thing winning for them might be more dangerous than the enemy they faced. On the walls of Minas Tirith, soldiers watched the southern field transform from stalemate to slaughter. They saw the Mumakil fall, saw the Haradrim scatter, saw their own salvation written in blood and broken bodies. No one cheered. A sergeant old enough to have fought in 3 wars spat over the wall and muttered to no one in particular.
We're going to have to live with this when it's done.
The soldier beside him said nothing. Just gripped his spear tighter and watched the distant figure carve through reinforcements like they were training dummies. The Battle of the Pelennor fields ground on. Victory was coming. Everyone could feel it now, but it felt nothing like salvation. Theoden rode at the spear tip of his people's fury. Around him, the Rohirrim carved through Mordor's scattered forces with the efficiency of men who had already accepted death and found freedom in the acceptance. Spears broke, swords dulled. Horses stumbled over corpses that carpeted the field in layers. But they did not stop. The king was 70 years old. His arm ached from holding the spear, his vision blurred at the edges. But Snowmane ran beneath him with the strength of youth, and as long as the horse could run, Theoden would ride. Ahead, a company of orcs rallied around a captain in black armor. They formed a shield wall. Locked ranks, braced for the impact they knew was coming. Snowmane gathered himself and leapt. The shield wall shattered. The captain fell beneath hooves. The Rohirrim poured through the gap, widening it, turning organized resistance into scattered flight. And then the air changed. Not temperature, not smell. Something deeper. A wrongness that made breath catch in throats and skin crawl without understanding why. Horses began to shy. Men looked around, searching for the source of sudden dread. From the east, a shape descended. The Witch King of Angmar, had been hunting the northern flank, had been carving through Rohirrim companies with calculated precision, using his fell beast's mobility to strike where the cavalry was thinnest. But now he turned, banked south, dropped toward the point where Rohan's king rode at the head of his finest warriors. Because destiny had arrangements to keep. Theoden saw the shape coming, saw the black wings spread wide against the morning sky, saw the crowned figure mounted atop nightmare made flesh. He knew what approached, had been told the stories, had heard Gandalf's warnings about the Lord of Angmar and the fate of those who faced him. He raised his spear anyway.
Form on me, stand fast.
His household knights closed ranks. These were men who had ridden with Theoden for decades, who had stood beside him through plague and treachery and the long years when Saruman's poison seeped through Rohan's halls. They would not abandon him now. The Witch King dove, his hand extended, not holding weapon, not casting visible spell, just reaching out as though to pluck something unworthy from existence. And he spoke. No words in any language the living should know. Just sound cold and vast and empty of anything resembling mercy. The syllables hit like physical force. Men cried out. Some dropped from their saddles without wound. Others simply sat frozen minds, refusing to process what their ears had heard. Black breath, the curse of the Nazgul, carried on voice and presence. It seeped into lungs, wrapped around hearts, whispered that all hope was ash, and all courage was foolishness, and death was the only certainty worth accepting. Theoden's knights scattered, not from cowardice, from simple biological impossibility of holding formation when the body's deepest instincts screamed to flee or collapse. Horses bolted. Men who had faced cavalry charges without flinching now found themselves gasping for air that wouldn't come. A space opened around the king, alone, mounted, holding his spear with hands that had begun to shake. The Witch King's fell beast landed 10 yards away. Claws dug furrows in earth, wings folded with a sound like sails collapsing. The crowned figure sat motionless, assessing, savoring. His mace materialized, black iron spiked, carried more for the terror it inspired than any need for such crude instruments. Theoden drove his heels into Snowmane's flanks. The horse, brave beyond measure, trained for war, since birth charged. Not from confidence, from the bond between rider and mount, because the man on his back had asked, and that was reason enough. The Witch King raised one hand. A black dart materialized. Not thrown, not shot. Simply there, and then moving, crossing the distance in the space between heartbeats. It took Snowmane in the chest. The horse's front legs buckled. Momentum carried him forward into a stumble that became a collapse. Theoden felt the world tilt, felt himself thrown, tried to roll clear, but age and armor made him slow. Snowmane's body landed across his legs. The impact drove air from lungs, ribs cracked. The king lay pinned beneath 1,000 pounds of dying horse, watching his faithful companion's eyes glaze as blood pooled beneath them both.
Snowmane, forgive me.
The Witch King dismounted, stepped forward with the unhurried certainty of something that had killed kings before, and would again. He reached out. Not holding weapon, not casting visible spell, just extending toward this prey as though to pluck something unworthy from existence. Theoden tried to pull free, could not. His sword lay 3 feet away, fallen from his grip in the fall. He reached for it anyway, fingers straining, knowing the futility, but refusing to die without trying. And a voice rang out. Young, defiant, cracking slightly with fear but holding steady despite it.
Begone, foul Dwimmerlake, Lord of Carrion, leave the dead in peace.
A rider stepped into the space between king and executioner. Smaller than the knights, slender, helmed and armored in the style of Rohan, but sitting the horse with a grace that spoke of desperation rather than training. Dernhelm, the young rider who had insisted on joining the muster, who had ridden in the rear ranks unnoticed in the chaos of war. The Witch King turned his crowned head toward this interruption.
Come not between the Nazgul and his prey, or he will not slay thee in thy turn. He will bear thee away to the houses of lamentation, beyond all darkness, where thy flesh shall be devoured and thy shriveled mind be left naked to the lidless eye.
The voice was hollow, empty. The words themselves were not threat, but promise spoken with the certainty of one who had made such promises before and kept them. Dernhelm's horse reared, panicked. The rider fought to control it, pulling hard on reins, speaking words that were half command and half plea. And then, with movements sharp and precise, the rider reached up and pulled the helm free. Hair fell, golden, braided for war but unmistakably a woman's.
Do what you will, but I will hinder it if I may.
Eowyn, daughter of Eomund, niece to the king, who had been left behind to tend the hall while men rode to war, and who had followed anyway, because she would not watch the world end from behind locked doors. The Witch King laughed, not with voice, just a sound like wind through a crypt. Mockery without joy. The mace lowered slightly, as though this inconvenience did not even merit full attention.
Hinder me, thou fool. No living man may hinder me.
But no living man am I, you look upon a woman. Eowyn, I am Eomund's daughter. You stand between me and my lord and kin. Be gone, if you be not deathless, for living or dark undead, I will smite you if you touch him.
She charged, not with the power of trained cavalry, not with the weight of armored knights, but with the speed of someone who knew hesitation meant death. Her blade swept low, aimed not at the Witch King, but at his mount. The fell beast's head came around. Jaws opened. Eowyn's sword took it in the neck, just behind the jaw, and drove deep. The creature shrieked a sound that made the black breath seem gentle and collapsed sideways, pinning its master's leg beneath its bulk. The Witch King tore free, rose, loomed. The black robes swirled despite no wind. The crown caught what little light remained and threw it back corrupted. Eowyn stood her ground. She raised her shield, raised her sword, feet planted, every line of her body screaming defiance at something that should have made her knees buckle. The Witch King's mace fell. It struck the shield dead center. Metal shrieked. The impact traveled up her arm like lightning. Bone cracked. The shield shattered into pieces that fell around her feet like broken promises. Her arm hung useless, broken at the elbow. The sword wavered in her left hand. The mace rose again, and from behind the Witch King, something small moved through the scattered bodies. A shape barely 3 feet tall, forgotten in the chaos, crawling on hands and knees through mud and blood. Meriadoc Brandybuck, Hobbit of the Shire, who had begged to be allowed to ride to war and been refused by everyone, except a young woman who understood what it meant to be left behind. He had fallen when black breath struck, had lain there gasping while the world fought around him. But now he crawled, reached the Witch King's back, saw the gap between boot and mail, and drew his blade, not any blade. The dagger given to him by Tom Bombadil, taken from the Barrow Downs, forged in Westerness before Angmar's shadow fell across the north. A weapon made specifically to harm what should not be harmed. He drove it into the back of the Witch King's knee. The blade sank to the hilt, bit through whatever passed for flesh in that ancient body. And the Witch King stumbled, dropped the mace, reached back with hands that suddenly moved without their usual certainty. Eowyn lunged, one-handed, broken, operating on will alone. Her sword drove upward into the space between crown and mantle, into the void, where a face should have been and was not. The Witch King screamed, not sound, pressure. A wave of force that flattened grass and made men 100 yards away cover their ears. The black robes collapsed inward. The crown tumbled to earth. And the scream went on rising in pitch until it passed beyond hearing into something felt in bones and teeth. Then silence. The robes lay empty. The crown rolled to a stop against Theoden's outstretched hand. And on the wind, just for a moment, something passed away. Something old and terrible, and bound to malice for so long it had forgotten any other mode of being. It was gone. Eowyn fell. The sword dropped from her hand. Her legs buckled. She hit the ground beside her uncle and did not rise. Her breathing came shallow and labored. Black breath still coiled in her lungs, draining strength faster than any wound. Merry crawled toward her, made it 3 feet before his own strength failed. The dagger lay where it had dropped blade, already beginning to corrode from contact with flesh that should never have existed. Theoden tried to speak. Blood filled his mouth. The weight on his chest had become crushing. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. But through that tunnel he saw his niece lying still, saw the empty robes of his enemy, saw the morning sky above them all.
I go to my fathers, and even in their mighty company I shall not now be ashamed.
His hand reached out, found Eowyn's, held it with what little strength remained.
Eowyn, my sister's child, I knew you, forgive me.
The hand went limp. King Theoden, 17th in the line of Yorl, died on the Pelennor fields, with his enemy's crown beneath his hand, and his niece's tears soaking into earth beside him. Around them, the battle raged on. Rohirrim companies, seeing their king down, did not break, did not flee. They fought harder, rode faster, poured grief and fury into every spear thrust, turning loss into fuel for a slaughter that would mark the field for generations. Eomer, fighting 200 yards north, heard the cry go up, heard his king was down, saw the space where the Witch King's fell beast had been, and understood what had happened.
Death, death, death.
He drove his riders forward with renewed savagery. Not vengeance. Vengeance was too clean a word for what boiled in his chest. This was rage refined into action, grief hammered into blade edge. And across the field, in the shadow of Minas Tirith's walls, Gandalf stood on Shadowfax and felt the moment the Witch King passed from the world. Felt it like a rope snapping, a pressure releasing. One of the great powers that had bound the age, finally severed. But he felt something else too, another presence. Still moving, still cutting, still rewriting the battle's outcome through sheer refusal to acknowledge any rule about what was possible. As Kenpachi had not come to the king's aid, had not turned when the Witch King descended, had simply continued east toward whatever concentration of enemy forces looked most promising, operating on instincts that had nothing to do with prophecy or destiny, or the careful balance Gandalf had spent centuries trying to maintain. The wizard's hands tightened on his staff. 2 catastrophes. One ended, one still burning. The prophecy had been fulfilled. The Lord of Angmar had fallen to no man brought down by woman and halfling in the manner Glorfindel had foreseen 1,000 years ago. But the cost was written in bodies. In a king dead before his time. In a woman who might never wake. In a battle won by forces that cared nothing for the songs that would be sung about it. Gandalf turned Shadowfax north, toward where Eomer's riders were rallying, toward where medics would be needed, toward the work of tending what could be saved from the wreckage of victory. Behind him, the eastern field burned, literally. Something had set the remaining siege equipment aflame. Whether by design or accident, he could not tell and did not have time to investigate. The Battle of the Pelennor fields ground toward its conclusion. The prophecies had kept their word. The heroes had played their parts. And the thing that cared nothing for prophecy or heroism continued its work, writing a different kind of story in blood and broken ground. The Witch King's death should have broken them. Mordor's host, tens of thousands strong, drawn from every dark corner of Sauron's domain, should have scattered when their greatest captain vanished into wind and silence. Should have panicked. Should have run. They did not, because the lords of Mordor had learned across millennia of war not to trust any single point of failure. And in the void left by the Witch King's passing, another voice rose to fill the silence. Gothmog, lieutenant of Minas Morgul, commander of Sauron's reserve forces, a creature whose name was whispered in the same breath as ancient terrors, though few in the West knew what manner of thing bore it. He stood on a rise south of the main battle, surrounded by captains and message runners. His armor was black iron, worked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. In one hand he held a standard, the Eye of Sauron, lidless and burning red against black cloth. And he spoke orders in the black speech that carried across the field with unnatural clarity. The scattered orc companies rallied. Not perfectly, not with the discipline of Haradrim infantry, but enough. They stopped running, reformed around new banners, turned to face the Rohirrim who had driven so deep into their ranks. Gothmog's strategy was simple and brutal. The cavalry had overextended, driven wedges into Mordor's host, but lacked the numbers to hold the ground they'd taken. Now those wedges would be pinched off, surrounded, destroyed piece by piece, while fresh reserves moved up to finish what the Witch King had started. Drums beat new rhythms. Companies that had been held in reserve Easterlings in scale armor, Variegs with their two-handed axes, even a few trolls that had survived the earlier slaughter began moving toward the flanks of Rohan's thrust. Eomer saw it happening and knew they were in trouble. He sat on his horse in the middle of what had been Mordor's center, surrounded by bodies and burning siege equipment. Around him, his riders regrouped, bloodied, exhausted, horses foaming and stumbling. They had ridden through darkness and battle without rest, driven by grief and fury, and the desperate need to reach Minas Tirith before it fell. They had succeeded. The city still stood. The Witch King was dead, and now they were about to be annihilated.
We're too far in. If they close the gap behind us...
One of his captains spoke what everyone could see. The Rohirrim had carved too deep, had pursued victory with the single-minded focus of cavalry doing what cavalry did best. But cavalry needed room to maneuver, needed open ground and clear lines of retreat. They had neither. Eomer looked north toward Minas Tirith. The city's gates stood open. Wounded were being carried inside. Defenders on the walls watched the field. Close. So close. But the space between the Rohirrim's position and safety was filling with enemy forces that had found their courage again.
We break through or we die here. I'll not leave my uncle's body to be desecrated by orcs.
His voice was steady. The captains nodded. They would follow. Would charge one more time because there was no other choice that preserved honor. But before Eomer could give the order, a shout went up from the southern edge of the battle. Not a war cry. Something else. Confusion. Fear. Soldiers pointing toward the river Anduin, toward the docks at Harland, where the river bent closest to the Pelennor. Eomer turned to look. Ships, a fleet moving upriver against the current. Dozens of them. Black sails catching wind oars, beating water in perfect rhythm. The lead vessel was massive, a warship built for ramming and boarding, its prow carved into shapes that suggested teeth. Corsairs of Umbar. The sea raiders who had harried Gondor's coasts for generations. Allies of Sauron come at last with reinforcements to finish what siege engines could not. The sight hit like a fist to the stomach, because if fresh forces were landing at Harlan forces that had not spent days in siege, that were not exhausted or scattered, then the battle was over. The Rohirrim would be trapped between Gothmog's rally and Corsair steel. Minas Tirith would fall despite everything. On the city walls, soldiers saw the black sails and despaired. Some dropped their weapons. Others simply sat down, where they stood, too tired to process this final cruelty. They had held, had endured, had watched allies ride to their aid and seen ancient evils broken, and now the sea would swallow them anyway. The black ships drew closer, close enough to see figures on deck, close enough to hear the creak of rigging and the splash of oars. Then the lead ship's mainsail dropped, not torn, not damaged, deliberately released furled aside by hands working in perfect coordination. And beneath it, a second banner rose, white, clean, brilliant against the morning sky. The Tree of Gondor. 7 stars. A crown. The ancient standard of Elendil, not seen in full regalia since the kings had failed and the stewards took their place. For a moment no one moved, could not process what they were seeing. Could not reconcile black ships with white banners, corsair vessels with royal standards. Then trumpets sounded from the ships. Clear, high. The call of Gondor's forces rallying to battle. And figures began pouring over the rails onto Harlan's docks. Not corsairs, rangers. Northern Dunedain in gray cloaks and weathered leather. Men of Lamadan and Lossernach, Blackroot Vale fighters. The southern fiefdoms of Gondor thought lost or unable to muster now arriving en masse because someone had gathered them. At their head, a mutt stepped onto the dock, tall, dark-haired, carrying a sword that caught sunlight and threw it back with an edge that suggested reforging from ancient stock. His face was weathered, eyes gray as winter seas. He looked across the Pelennor fields, across the carnage and smoke and desperate combat, and his expression showed neither triumph nor joy, just grim determination. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, had come to Gondor's aid.
To the field for Gondor for the king.
The cry went up from 1,000 throats. The reinforcements charged from the docks, hitting Mordor's southern flank with the force of men who had traveled far and fought hard just to reach this moment. The enemy formation buckled, because Gothmog's strategy sound, when it involved trapping exhausted cavalry, had not accounted for fresh forces attacking from an entirely different direction. The companies moving to encircle the Rohirrim suddenly found themselves fighting on 2 fronts. Eomer saw the shift and understood immediately.
Forth ride them down, leave none alive.
The Rohirrim charged again. Not toward safety, toward the enemy companies that had been about to close the trap. They hit from one side while Aragorn's forces drove from the other, and the orcs caught between simply broke. The pincer had reversed. What should have been Rohan's annihilation became a slaughter of Mordor's reorganized forces. Gothmog's careful rally dissolved as companies that had just found their courage lost it again under coordinated assault. On the walls of Minas Tirith, soldiers who had sat in despair rose to their feet, not cheering, not yet, but breathing again, gripping weapons, understanding that perhaps they would see another sunset. Gandalf stood on Shadowfax and watched the black ships disgorge their cargo of unexpected salvation. His eyes tracked Aragorn moving through the press of combat with the certainty of someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The wizard's expression remained grave because he could see the larger pattern. Could see how this battle, already rewritten by forces outside the music, was settling into new configurations that would shape the age to come. 2 powers had turned the tide today. One wore a crown in waiting and carried the sword of kings. The other was still moving through the eastern sections of the field, carving through whatever remained between it and the horizon. Kenpachi had not paused when the ships arrived, had not turned to see the banners or assess the new variables. He was 300 yards east, deep in what remained of Haradrim resistance, cutting through rallying companies with the same methodical efficiency he had shown since entering the battle. The reinforcements did not concern him. The shifting tactical situation meant nothing. There was simply the next enemy, and the one after that, and he would continue until none remained, or something interesting finally appeared. Gothmog saw this and recalculated, saw his careful strategy falling apart from 2 directions, Aragorn's disciplined assault, and whatever that thing was that operated without strategy at all. The battle was lost, not the war. Sauron's power remained vast. The Dark Tower still stood. Armies waited in Mordor that dwarfed what had been committed here. But the Pelennor was lost. Gothmog gave orders. Withdrawal. Protect the retreat. Get as many forces back to Morgul Vale and the Black Gate as possible before the jaws closed completely. Horns blew, drums changed rhythm. The host of Mordor, what remained of it, began pulling back toward the east. Not running, not panicking, but moving with the discipline of soldiers who understood the difference between tactical retreat and rout. Some did not make it, because the Rohirrim were beyond mercy now. Because Aragorn's forces had traveled too far to let the enemy slip away clean. Because Kenpachi continued cutting regardless of whether they ran or stood. The field became a killing ground. Orcs died by hundreds. Trolls were surrounded and brought down. Haradrim fought rear-guard actions that bought their fellows minutes of retreat at the cost of their lives. And slowly, as the sun climbed toward noon, the fighting began to wind down. Not from victory celebrations, from simple exhaustion. Men and horses could only fight so long before muscle gave out and will failed. The enemy was fleeing. Let them go. Let them carry word back to their dark lord that Gondor had held. Aragorn met Éomer on the field between the city and the river. Neither dismounted. Neither spoke immediately. They simply looked at each other. Two men who had inherited wars they did not start but would finish anyway.
Your timing was impeccable.
Éomer's voice was hoarse. His armor was dented in a dozen places. Blood, his and others, soaked through tears in the mail.
We came as fast as the river allowed. Is Theoden dead by the Witch King's hand? My sister stands watch over him until we can bear him home.
Aragorn's expression hardened. He said nothing. There were no words that would help. Just the weight of another loss added to the ledger of this war.
The battle is won, but the war continues. Sauron will not forgive this. He'll come with everything he has.
They both knew it. This was respite, not resolution. Aragorn looked past Éomer toward the eastern edge of the field, where smoke still rose and the sounds of combat had not entirely ceased.
What is that?
He pointed. Not at any specific landmark, but at the pattern of destruction. The corridors of dead. The way formations had been carved apart by something operating on principles he did not recognize. Éomer followed his gaze, and his jaw tightened.
I don't know, none of us do. It came through the gate when all hope seemed lost, and it's been killing ever since. Gandalf calls it something from beyond the music.
Aragorn studied the distant shape still moving through enemy remnants.
Can it be controlled? I don't think it wants to be, and I don't think anyone could make it even if they tried.
They sat in silence, watching the thing that had helped save them continue its work, without acknowledgement or concern for what it had saved. Around them, the battle of the Pelennor fields guttered toward its end. Medics moved among the wounded. The dead were counted. Weapons were gathered from the mud. Victory tasted like ash and blood, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new horrors. But today at least Minas Tirith stood, and that would have to be enough. Minas Tirith breathed, but it was the breathing of something wounded. Of a city that had survived not through strength but through desperate gambles and forces no one fully understood. The dead covered the Pelennor fields in layers. Thousands of them. Orc and man and horse lying together in the mud distinctions of allegiance, meaningless now that the killing had stopped. Crows circled overhead. The work of burial would take weeks. Inside the city, the houses of healing overflowed. Men lay on makeshift cots in hallways and courtyards. Healers moved among them with too little supplies and too many patients. The air smelled of blood and athelas, the healing herb that grew wild in the north, but was precious here, brought by rangers who had followed Aragorn south. In one of the quieter chambers, 3 figures lay unconscious. Faramir's steward's son, who had been struck by a poisoned dart. Iowin, who had stood against the Witch King and paid the price in broken bones and black breath. Merry Small, even on his bed, who had driven a blade into ancient evil and felt it reach back. Aragorn moved among them. His hands, calloused from years holding sword and bow, now held leaves of athelas, crushing them in water that steamed, despite no fire beneath the basin. The scent filled the room, clean, sharp. A smell of forests and high places where shadow had not yet reached. He laid his hand on Faramir's brow. spoke words in Sindarin that the healers did not know but recognized as older than their craft. Color returned to the steward's son's face. Breathing deepened. The gray pallor that spoke of death approaching lifted like fog before dawn. The healers watched and whispered, not about medicine, about what it meant when a man could call the dying back with touch and herb and ancient words. About what it meant that such a man wore travel-stained leather and carried a sword reforged from shards. Aragorn did not acknowledge them. Moved to Éowyn next, then Mary. Working with the focused intensity of someone who knew time was finite, and every moment counted. When he finished, all three slept peacefully. Wounds that should have taken weeks to heal were already beginning to close. Breath that had rattled with corruption now came steady. An old woman in healer's robes approached him as he washed his hands.
You have the touch. The old songs spoke of kings who could heal, but I thought them legend.
Legends persist because they remember truth.
He dried his hands and left the chamber without ceremony. There was no time for more. The war did not pause for miracles. That evening, in a tower chamber overlooking the city, the captains gathered. Aragorn, Gandalf, Éomer, who sat with his uncle's crown on the table before him, a weight he had not yet claimed, but would have to. Imrahil of Dol Amroth, prince of the coastal fiefdoms. Others. Men who had survived the siege and now faced decisions that would shape what came after. Maps spread across the table. Mordor to the east, the Black Gate, the roads leading there. Gandalf spoke first, staff resting against his chair.
Sauron's eye turns toward his borders. He counts his losses and plans his response. We have days, perhaps a week. Then he will come with everything he holds in reserve, and Minas Tirith will not survive a second siege.
Silence held the room.
So we wait here and die slowly.
Éomer's voice was rough. He had not slept since his uncle fell, had barely eaten. The crown sat before him like an accusation.
No, we march.
Aragorn traced a line on the map with one finger. From Minas Tirith, east across the Pelennor, through lands held by Mordor, to the Black Gate itself.
We cannot win by arms. Sauron's reserves outnumber us 10-1, but we can draw his attention, make him look outward instead of inward. Give those who carry the real burden time to finish what they started.
He did not name Frodo, did not speak of the ring. But everyone in the room understood what burden he meant. Imrahil leaned forward.
A diversion. We march to our deaths to buy time for others. We march to give hope a chance. Whether we die or not depends on whether that hope is enough.
The captains looked at each other, looked at the maps, at the impossible distances and the overwhelming odds, and one by one they nodded, because there was no other choice that preserved honor. No other path that gave Middle-earth a future beyond Sauron's shadow. On the 18th day of March, 7,000 men assembled outside Minas Tirith's gates. Not an army of conquest. A column of survivors. Men from Gondor who had held the walls. Rohirrim who had ridden through darkness. Rangers of the north. A handful of dwarves who had traveled far to honor old alliances. They stood in loose formation, checking weapons, adjusting armor, saying quiet farewells to those who would remain behind. No trumpets sounded, no banners waved in celebration. This was not a march to glory. This was 7,000 men walking toward probable death because the alternative was worse. Aragorn rode at their head on a gray horse. Gandalf beside him on Shadowfax. Behind them the captains and their companies. They stretched back along the road, smaller than it should have been, larger than anyone had right to expect after what the siege had cost. And at the formation's edge, walking alone, a figure in torn black and white, moved eastward with the same unhurried pace he had maintained since entering this world. Kenpachi had not asked permission to join, had not offered service or sworn oaths. He simply walked in the same direction the column marched because the scent of war led that way and nothing else interested him. The soldiers gave him wide berth, walked on the opposite side of the road, tried not to look directly at the thing that had saved them, and might kill them just as easily if the mood struck. Gandalf watched him from Shadowfax and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The die was cast. They moved out. They traveled east across the Pelennor, skirting the worst of the carnage. Past Osgiliath's ruins, into lands that had been held by Mordor for so long that the very earth seemed sick. The road climbed toward mountains. Air grew thin and cold. At night, campfires burned low and conversations died early. Men slept with weapons close, because the darkness here pressed against the mind in ways that had nothing to do with absence of light. On the 19th, they passed close to Morgul Vale. The valley ran north into mountains, like a wound in the landscape. Minas Morgul stood at its mouth, once a tower of Gondor, now corrupted into something that hurt to look at. Green light pulsed from its windows. The air stank of old death. They did not enter the vale, swung wide, giving the cursed place the respect fear demanded. But even miles away, men felt it. A pressure behind the eyes, a weight on the chest, the sense that they were being watched by something vast and patient. Horses stumbled. Men walked with heads down, focusing on the road ahead, refusing to look toward the sickly glow. Kenpachi glanced toward it once. His expression did not change, just noted the location and kept walking. Whatever resided there was old and bound to its territory, not worth the detour. By the 20th, the column had traveled deep into enemy territory. Scouts reported orc patrols pulling back, watching, not engaging, but tracking their progress with the patience of hunters waiting for prey to enter the trap. Aragorn knew what it meant. Sauron was letting them come, drawing them deeper, preparing something. Still they pressed on. On the 21st at midday, the trap sprung. The road ran through a narrow defile between two rocky ridges. Perfect ambush terrain. The lead companies were halfway through when horns blew from both sides. Orcs poured from concealed positions, not thousands. Sauron was too clever to waste large numbers on a diversion force. He could simply let march to their doom. But enough. 500, maybe 6. Supported by Easterlings in scale armor who knew how to fight in formation. The lead companies took the first impact. Shields locked, spears braced. Training held against surprise, and they began pushing back, but the ambush had achieved its purpose. The march was stalled, compressed, vulnerable to archery from the ridges. Arrows fell like rain. Men died with shafts through throat and eye. Horses screamed. The orderly march dissolved into desperate combat as companies tried to deploy in terrain that gave them no room. Then Kenpachi walked into the defile. He did not hurry, did not charge. Simply moved forward through the press of fighting bodies with the same measured pace he had maintained since the march began. The orcs saw him and recognized death. Those with any survival instinct broke immediately. Scattered back toward the ridges, abandoning the ambush, choosing life over whatever orders had sent them here. Those too stupid or loyal to run died. The blade moved in arcs that carved through armor and flesh and bone without distinction. Orcs fell in pieces. Easterlings who tried to hold formation found themselves standing beside empty air where their shield mates had been a heartbeat before. 30 seconds. That was how long the ambush lasted once Kenpachi engaged. The survivors fled up the ridges, scrambling over rocks, throwing down weapons to climb faster. Some made it. Most did not. Silence settled over the defile, broken only by the moans of wounded and the ragged breathing of soldiers who had thought they were dead. Aragorn rode forward through the carnage, looked at the bodies, at the soldiers still standing, faces pale, gripping weapons with shaking hands. They had survived. The ambush had been broken, but there was no relief in the faces around him. No gratitude. Just the hollow-eyed stare of men who understood they had been saved by something they could not control and might not survive.
Reform the column. Treat the wounded. We march in an hour.
His voice was steady. Commands given. Men moved to obey because orders were something comprehensible in a situation that defied comprehension. Gandalf dismounted and walked among the dead. Counted them, 23. 23 men who had survived the Pelennor only to die here in a nameless defile for a diversion that might not even work. The wizard's face was grim. This was the cost. The real cost. Not just the dead, but the slow erosion of hope. The understanding that even their victories came at prices they could barely afford to pay. Kenpachi had already moved to the front of the column. Waiting. Not for orders. Just waiting for the march to resume so he could continue east. The column reformed. Slower than before. Quieter. Men helped wounded onto horses. Left the dead where they lay because there was no time for proper burial, and enemy territory was no place to linger. They moved forward. By the 23rd, scouts reported the Black Gate visible on the horizon. The Morannon. 2 great towers flanking a pass that led into Mordor proper. Gates of iron 20 feet high. And behind those gates, the armies Sauron had been gathering for decades. The column had shrunk. Not from combat, there had been no more ambushes, but from attrition, sickness, injuries that worsened on the march, horses that collapsed, men who simply could not go further. 6,000 remained when they made camp within sight of the gate. They built fires, ate what rations they had, checked weapons one more time because tomorrow they would march to the Morannon itself and demand entry. It was insane. Everyone knew it. Sauron would answer with overwhelming force. The 6,000 would die on that black field before the gates, and the diversion would have bought perhaps a day. Perhaps 2, but it was the only move left on the board. Aragorn stood apart from the fires looking toward the gate. Gandalf joined him.
Do you think he's there at the mountain? I choose to believe he is. Because if I am wrong, then we've marched these men to their deaths for nothing.
They stood in silence, 2 figures against the darkness. Behind them 6,000 soldiers prepared for what would likely be their last battle. And somewhere in that camp, moving between firelight and shadow, a presence walked that cared nothing for hope or despair or the careful calculations that guided mortal wars. Kenpachi looked east toward the gate and smiled. Tomorrow would be interesting. The slag hills rose like broken teeth before the Morannon. Mounds of ash and slag and shattered stone piled high by centuries of industry within Mordor's borders. The ground beneath was black, cracked, lifeless. Nothing grew here. Nothing could. 6,000 men arrayed themselves across those hills in 2 rings. The first ring faced the Black Gate directly. Aragorn at its center, Gandalf beside him. Banners of Gondor and Rohan streaming in wind that carried the stench of sulfur and decay. The second ring curved behind, anchored by Éomer on one flank and Prince Imrahil on the other. Not a formation meant to win. A formation meant to die with dignity. The soldiers knew it. Stood with shields locked and spears braced anyway, because this was what they had come to do. Draw the eye. Give 2 hobbits time to finish what greater powers could not. Before them, the Morannon loomed. 2 towers flanked a pass carved through mountain. Between them, gates of iron 20 feet high, worked with symbols that predated Sauron's claim to this place. Ancient, cruel, built to intimidate before they killed. The gates were closed. Aragorn rode forward. Not far. Just enough that his voice would carry to whatever watched from those towers. He wore mail beneath his cloak. The sword across his back caught morning light. Andúril reforged from the shards of Narsil, the blade that had cut the ring from a Sauron's hand 3,000 years ago. He did not draw it, not yet.
Come forth. Let the Lord of the Black Land come forth. Justice shall be done upon him.
His voice rang across the dead ground. Clear, unafraid. The challenge of one who knew he faced overwhelming odds and chose defiance anyway. For a long moment, nothing answered. Then deep within the pass, mechanisms groaned, metal screamed against metal. The gates began to open. Not quickly, slowly, deliberately, each inch revealing more of the darkness beyond. And as they opened, figures emerged. Not an army, not yet. An embassy. A rider on a black horse came first. Tall, draped in robes that suggested armor beneath, but showed no face, no flesh, nothing human. Behind him, a standard-bearer carried a banner, the eye, lidless and burning, wrought in red on black cloth. The rider approached to within speaking distance and stopped. When he spoke, the voice was hollow, mocking. The words of someone who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake.
Is there anyone in this route with authority to treat with me, or indeed with wit to understand me?
Gandalf urged Shadowfax forward.
We know you for what you are. Speak if you have aught to say.
The rider, the mouth of Sauron, ambassador of the Dark Tower, laughed. Not with joy. With the sound of something that had forgotten what joy meant.
So, the old greybeard still has a tongue. And what of this ragged king who dares challenge my master?
He gestured dismissively toward Aragorn.
My master does not treat with rebels who bring no tribute, but he is merciful. He offers terms.
The mouth reached into his robes and withdrew something that caught the light. A coat, small, made of mithril that shone like silver even in this cursed place. Beside it a sword elven, make the kind given to hobbits who had traveled far from the Shire. And a gray-green cloak fastened with a brooch shaped like a leaf. Frodo's coat, Sam's blade, the gifts of Lothlorien. The mouth held them high.
These tokens we found. The spies who bore them are now in the Dark Tower's keeping. My master will spare them if you withdraw beyond Anduin, if you yield all lands east of the river, if you acknowledge his dominion.
The words landed like stones in deep water, because everyone understood what they meant. The quest had failed. Frodo and Sam were captured or dead. The ring was in Sauron's hands. All hope was ash. Silence held the field. Men stared at those tokens, proof of failure, and felt something break inside their chests. The careful courage they had maintained through siege and march and the certainty of death crumbled. Because death with purpose was one thing. Death for nothing was another entirely. Gandalf's knuckles whitened on his staff, but he did not speak, did not move, just sat on Shadowfax as though carved from stone, and his silence was answer enough.
No.
The mouth's mockery deepened.
Then die here. Die knowing you threw away their lives and yours for pride. My master's armies will...
Aragorn spurred his horse forward, closed the distance, reached out and took the tokens from the mouth's hands before the creature could react.
These are not yours to bargain with. Your master is a liar and a thief. We do not treat with him. We do not acknowledge him. And we will stand here until his lies fall with his tower.
The mouth's horse reared. The ambassador's voice rose in fury.
Fools, you will beg for the mercy you refuse my master's wrath.
But Gandalf had already turned Shadowfax. The wizard rode back toward the rings of soldiers, and Aragorn followed. The parley was over. The mouth sat for a moment, rage radiating from his stillness. Then he wheeled his horse and rode back through the gates at full gallop. And behind him, the mechanisms groaned again. The gates opened wider, fully, revealing the pass beyond and the armies waiting there. Drums beat, horns sounded. And from the Morannon poured a tide of iron and malice and numbers that beggared comprehension. Orcs in their thousands. Trolls moving among them like boulders given purpose. Easterlings in scale mail. Variegs. Men of Harad who had marched north at Sauron's call. All of them flooding out onto the slag hills in formations that spoke of discipline and coordination. And from the flanks from the mountains on either side of the pass, more came. Hidden forces now revealed. Archers on the heights. Companies that had waited in concealment for the trap to close. 10 to 1. Maybe more. The exact numbers did not matter when the reality was a black tide that rolled toward 6,000 men, standing alone on dead ground. Aragorn drew on Durrell. The blade sang as it left the scabbard.
Hold stand and fight for Gondor, for all you hold dear on this good earth.
The rings tightened, shields locked, spears lowered. Men who had accepted death now faced its arrival and found one last reserve of defiance to draw upon. The armies of Mordor charged. The impact was not sudden, was not clean. It was the grinding collision of forces that should never have met iron against flesh, hatred against desperate courage, overwhelming numbers against the stubborn refusal to yield. The outer ring buckled, held, buckled again. Men fought and died in the space of breaths. Orcs clambered over their own dead to reach the defenders. Trolls swung clubs that crushed 3 soldiers at a time. The line wavered, compressed, began to fold inward as pressure from all sides sought to collapse it entirely. And standing at the point where the assault hit hardest, a figure in torn black and white stepped forward. Kenpachi had waded through the parley with visible impatience, had watched the gates open and the armies pour out with something approximating satisfaction. This finally was worthy of attention. He moved into the thickest press of enemies. The blade carved arcs through air and flesh without distinction. Orcs fell in pieces. A troll turned to face this new threat and died before it could swing its weapon. The wedge of Mordor's assault, designed to break the ring's center, simply ceased to exist as everything in Kenpachi's path was reduced to component parts. The pressure on the defenders eased. Not because the enemy withdrew, because a corridor of death opened in their ranks, and anything that tried to close it died. Aragorn saw it. Saw men who had been about to break instead finding space to breathe. Saw the impossible corridor and the figure maintaining it. But there was no time to process, no time to coordinate. The assault continued from every other direction, and survival meant fighting the enemy directly in front, not trying to understand the catastrophe, fighting beside you. The rings held, barely. Soldiers who should have been overrun in minutes instead found themselves in a grinding stalemate because one side of the pincer had been amputated. Gandalf stood at the inner ring's edge, staff raised, white fire blazing from its tip to drive back orcs that tried to flank the formation. But his eyes tracked eastward to Mount Doom, where smoke rose thick and black against the sky, waiting, hoping, trusting that somewhere on that mountain, 2 small figures were still climbing. The battle raged. Minutes felt like hours. Men fell, were dragged back. Others stepped forward to fill the gaps. A great troll, larger than any that had come before, smashed through a section of the outer ring. Its club crushed shields, scattered bodies, created a breach that orcs immediately poured through. Kenpachi turned on it. The troll saw him coming and roared. Brought its club around in an arc, meant to pulp anything in its path. The blade met the club mid-swing. Wood splintered. The club disintegrated. The blade continued without slowing and took the troll across the chest in a cut that divided it cleanly. The creature toppled backward into the orcs behind it. The breach sealed. The line held. And then the ground shook, not from combat. Not from the troll falling, from something deeper, fundamental, a tremor that ran through the earth like a shudder of pain. Fighting paused. Men and orcs alike stumbled, looked around for the source. To the east, Mount Doom erupted, not with lava, with force that spoke of something breaking deep in the world's bones. Fire shot into the sky, the mountain's peak split, and rolling out from it came a shockwave that was not physical, but struck harder than any blade. The armies of Mordor screamed, not in rage, in terror. In the sudden understanding that the power holding them, feeding them, binding their will to Sauron's had just been severed. The black gate shook, cracked. The towers on either side of the pass began to crumble. Stone that had stood for millennia could not stand without the will that had raised it. Sauron fell, not died. Things like Sauron did not die in ways mortals understood. But its destruction unmade him, stripped his power, left him diminished beyond recovery, a shadow without substance, unable to ever again take form or threaten the world. His armies felt it. The orcs broke. Completely. Turned and fled in every direction without coordination or thought. Some ran toward the pass, others into the mountains. Most simply scattered across the slag hills in blind panic. The trolls stood confused, lost. Without the will driving them, they were just animals dangerous but no longer coordinated. Some fought on from instinct. Others wandered in circles. The men of the east and south, who had come by choice or coercion, saw what was happening and began pulling back in better order. Not routing. Withdrawing. Understanding that whatever power had promised them victory was gone, and remaining meant death. The siege ended, not with a final clash, but with dissolution, with the sudden absence of the will that had held it together. Aragorn remained among his soldiers and watched the armies scatter, watched the towers fall, felt the tremor in his bones, and understood what it meant. It was destroyed. Frodo had succeeded. Around him, men began to weep, not from grief, from the overwhelming weight of relief, from understanding they would not die here, that the world would continue, that the impossible gamble had paid. Gandalf dismounted from Shadowfax, planted his staff in the ground, and simply stood head bowed, shoulders shaking with emotion too complex to name. Victory, but purchased with prices still being counted. Kenpachi stood in the center of the carnage and looked toward where Mount Doom still smoked on the horizon. His blade lowered. The smile faded.
That's it?
Not angry, not disappointed exactly, just noting. The battle had ended before he was finished. The tide had turned not because he had won, but because something else, something he could not cut, had changed the rules of engagement. He looked around at the fleeing armies, at the soldiers who were collapsing to their knees in exhaustion and relief, at the fallen towers and the broken gate. Then he turned and began walking, not back to Minas Tirith, not to any destination that mattered to the men still processing what had just happened. Just walking. Because the war was over, and there was nothing left here that interested him. Aragorn watched him go, and made no move to stop him. Made no attempt to call out thanks or acknowledgement. What could you say to something like that? What debt could you acknowledge when the thing that helped save you had done so not from valor, but from appetite? The sun climbed higher. The smoke from Mount Doom began to dissipate, and across the slag hills before the broken Morannon, 6,000 men who had expected to die instead began the slow work of survival. The war was over, but the world it left behind would bear scars deeper than any blade could carve. The Pelennor fields remembered. Grass grew again, slowly, hesitantly, green shoots pushing through soil that had been trampled and soaked with blood, until it seemed nothing would ever take root there again. But spring came as it always did, and life insisted on returning even to places that had been temples of death. The mounds rose in rows, burial cairns for the fallen. Thousands of them. Rohirrim who had ridden to war, knowing they would not return. Gondorians who had held walls until walls no longer mattered. Rangers who had followed their chieftains south and found their end far from the gray hills of home. Snowmane's Howe stood tallest, the great horse buried with honor beside his rider, and around the mound the grass grew thick and green unusually, so as though the earth itself mourned and offered tribute in the only way it could. But not everywhere healed. Near the center of the field where the Witch King had fallen, a stain marked the ground. Black, permanent. Grass would not grow there. Rain pooled and stayed, refusing to soak in. The earth rejected what had happened on that spot, and the rejection showed in dead soil that would bear nothing for generations. And cutting across the southern approach, a different scar, a crack, deep, running in a jagged line from the ruins of the Ramas Ikor toward the city. Not from siege engines, not from the trampling of armies, from something else. Something that had moved across the field and left the ground broken in its wake. The crack did not close, did not fill with new earth. It persisted, a wound that would not heal, because the thing that caused it operated by rules the world did not recognize. Gandalf stood at the edge of that fissure and looked down into darkness that seemed deeper than it should be. He had walked the length of it, had traced the path from where it began near the old outer wall to where it ended just short of the city gates. Everywhere Kenpachi had moved during the battle, the earth bore marks.
The world protests.
He spoke to no one. The field was empty, save for workers tending the mounds and a few soldiers standing watch over what had become a graveyard, larger than most villages.
It let him in, barely, and now it bears the cost of that tolerance.
The fissure would endure, would become legend. Scholars would argue about its origin. Songs would misremember what caused it, but it would stay a reminder that the victory purchased here came from sources no prophecy had foreseen. In Minas Tirith, the houses of healing worked beyond capacity. Weeks after the battle, men still lay in cots. Some would walk again, others would not. The healers moved among them with herbs and bandages and the kind of exhausted compassion that came from too many patients and too few hands. Aragorn visited daily. He had been crowned on the first day of May, a ceremony simple and brief because there was too much work left undone for lengthy celebrations. The crown sat on his head now, but he moved through the healing wards without ceremony, checking wounds, speaking with injured soldiers, using Athelas where it could help and presence where medicine failed. An old woman, the same who had spoken to him before, watched him work and murmured to another healer.
The old saying was true. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer.
She did not say it loudly, did not need to. The truth of it showed in faces that grew less gray under his touch, in fevers that broke, in the slow return of strength to bodies that had given everything and nearly lost themselves in the giving. But even the king's hands could not heal everything. Some wounds went deeper than flesh. Men woke screaming from dreams of black wings and endless darkness. Others sat hollow-eyed, present in body, but absent in all ways that mattered. The black breath had touched them, or simple horror had, and no herb could call them fully back. Iwin lay in one of the quieter chambers, awake now. Arms splinted, color returned to her face. But when she looked out the window toward the Pelennor, her expression showed something that had not been there before the battle await. An understanding of what it cost to stand against ancient evil and survive. She would return to Rohan with her uncle's body, would help her brother rule, would carry the memory of what she had done for the rest of her days. And she would never be quite the same. The eagles had borne Frodo and Sam from Mount Doom's ruin, had brought them to the field of Cormallen, where the remaining forces of the West gathered on the 8th day of April to honor those who had carried the real burden. Aragorn had knelt before them. The king before two hobbits who had walked into darkness and emerged barely alive. The gesture said more than any speech could about what they had accomplished and what it had cost. The gathered soldiers had cheered, not with the wild joy of total victory, but with the deeper satisfaction of duty done and survival earned. They had been the diversion, the ones who marched to probable death so others could finish the task. And they had lived, most of them. Gandalf addressed the assembly briefly, spoke of the end of the age, of how darkness had been thrown down, but not unmade, merely diminished beyond recovery, of vigilance needed even in peace. He did not mention the figure that had walked among them during the battle, did not try to explain what had emerged from the broken gate at Minas Tirith or where it had gone afterward, because there was no explanation that would help. No words that would ease the discomfort of knowing their salvation had come partly from something that cared nothing for their world or its laws. Kenpachi had left the Black Gate while the army still celebrated, had simply turned and walked away without word or gesture. No one tried to stop him. No one called out thanks or asked where he was going. They watched him go, with the same mixture of relief and unease they might feel watching a storm pass, grateful it had not destroyed them, but aware it had never chosen to spare them either. Some claimed to have seen him on the road east. Others swore he walked west toward the sea. A few insisted he had simply vanished between one step and the next, returning to wherever he had come from. The truth was simpler and stranger. He had grown bored. The war had ended not with a final clash, but with dissolution. The enemy had scattered. The momentum had stopped. And Kenpachi, who lived for the rush of battle against worthy opponents, found himself standing in a world at peace, with nothing left to fight. So he left, not through any gate or portal, not with ceremony or destination. He simply walked until Middle-earth could no longer hold him, until the rules binding him to this place loosened and let him slip away to wherever violence called loudest. And the world exhaled, not with relief exactly, but with the sense that a pressure had lifted, that reality could settle back into patterns it recognized without constantly bending around something that should not exist within its borders. The fissure endured. The scars persisted. But the thing that caused them was gone. On the coronation day, banners flew from Minas Tirith's walls, white, clean. The tree and stars bright against fabric that had been woven specifically for this occasion. Music played not the horns of war, but gentler instruments speaking of hope, cautiously reclaimed. Aragorn stood before the assembled people of Gondor and accepted the crown, spoke the oaths, promised stewardship of a realm that had endured through darkness and would endure beyond it. The people cheered, not wildly, not with abandon, but with the steady approval of those who had survived and understood what survival meant. From the walls one could see the Pelennor stretching east, could see the mounds rising like small hills across the plain, could see the green returning and the two scars, one black, one cracked, that would not heal. Gandalf stood beside Aragorn during the ceremony and felt the weight of ages shifting. His task here was nearly done. The new age was beginning, and it would be the age of men not wizards. But before he left Middle-earth's shores for the last time, he would ensure one thing was remembered. That victory was never clean, never simple, never purchased without cost that compounded in ways unforeseen. They had won. The Dark Tower had fallen. Sauron was diminished beyond return, but the world that remained bore scars deeper than any blade could carve, bore the memory of forces beyond prophecy and the understanding that even triumph could leave wounds that would ache for generations. Spring turned to summer. The grass grew thicker. The city rebuilt. Children were born who would never know the shadow that had nearly consumed their world. And on the Pelennor fields, that fissure ran dark and deep, a reminder that some battles are won not by valor alone, but by accidents of fate and forces that care nothing for the world they save. The age turned, but it turned bearing scars, and that would have to be enough.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.